very great privilege of having a wonderful conversation around our own history. And the focus for tonight is Dallas, Freedmen towns, and the story of Dr. Marcellus Clayton Cooper. I'll introduce these gentlemen each, and they will share a few brief words with you, and then we're going to have a conversation together. But we're going to kick it off with a conversation with Dr. David Newton, and then we will all come together. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce David Newton. David Newton is a classically trained sculptor. He's dedicating his career to transform ordinary African-American art, African-American people, and forgotten historical moments into unforgettable, timeless monuments of beauty. Mr. Newton was commissioned to sculpt the Dallas Freedmen Cemetery Memorial Park that many of you all have seen. You see those beautiful, powerful images. We have Mr. Newton to thank for that. And I don't know if he's planning on coming back to Dallas for any reason, or coming home to Dallas. I'm sure we can find a good reason to make you welcome here. So with that said, we're going to turn it over to Mr. Newton for him to talk about his presentation and what he wants to share with us here tonight.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Mr. Jorge Baldor, I appreciate the invitation. Your whole project has been a learning experience for me also. It's made me a richer person. I definitely want to thank Mr. Baldor for inviting me here on his different projects here. I just really appreciate him trying to bring people of color together and using their talents and skills to create some very important educational shows. I've learned a lot, that's for sure. It's been a learning experience for me, so I thank you for that. So I'm going to start out my talk here. Since I was chosen to create Freedmen's Memorial here to rededicate a cemetery that had been destroyed and just completely disrespected, as I was looking over photographs of people that were actually enslaved in the Dallas area, it just really, almost brings tears to your eyes. I know this photograph, from what I read about it, these people were from Dallas and they were celebrating Juneteenth. So they were in their Sunday best to kind of celebrate that. And I can see that holiday was been fought for so hard, in our modern times. But to people who were freedmen, who had been slaves and had been emancipated, that would have been the most important celebration they could ever, have. So I can see them that really being an important part of their culture and lives. Again, this is what they came from. So you can see the huge difference from people that are freedmen, that have went through the slave process and now are emancipated, to what their lives used to be, right? So all of the people we just saw in the previous photograph would have experienced this as a major part of their life at one time. And after emancipation, many enslaved people, now freedmen, came to Dallas, but all major cities in the South, and most major cities in the South had their own freedmen's town. It's just where the first freed slaves went to live. In that area was called the Freedmen's Town. Now, this is important also because a lot of the reason that the newly freed people went to these major cities to set up these Freedmen's Town, I read just recently, and very important to me because I didn't understand it. During Reconstruction, there were what they call Freedmen's Bureaus, right? And all these Freedmen's Bureaus were all centered in major cities. And those are the only institutions at that time that would provide protection and resources to the newly freed African Americans. So a lot of them came to these urban centers for protection right after the Civil War. This is just a scene from Freedmen's Town in the 1930s. To show it became a vibrant community. Now, as far as the history of Freedmen Cemetery, this kind of is controversial a little here and there, but my understanding from my reading is that the land for Freedmen Cemetery was bought in 1869 for $25. It was bought from a plantation owner who owned slaves on his plantation. My understanding is that there was a slave cemetery already on that plantation, and that's what was sold to the original buyers. It was bought for $25. So that means, according to some scholars and experts, that there was already a slave cemetery there where people had lived and died as slaves, and that part of that was purchased, and that was expanded. The first part that was bought was 1 acre for $25, and that was, again, in 1869. Over the years, another 3 acres were bought by the black community. That expanded the whole cemetery to 4 acres. So, this started early, and this is a scene of the tracks that came through town, the Freedmen's Town. So you can see the houses, that really did come through a community. That was a living community. There are houses within 20 feet of the tracks. So that really just, bam, just came straight through there. So that was the first desecration of part of the cemetery. Then in 1949 or so, they brought in the Central Expressway. That is what really just destroyed Freedmen's Town. They just took buildings that really destroyed the cemetery. There's no longer a cemetery after that. I was told that at the time the headstones, there are no headstones left. But of those few that were left, 2 or 3 that are incorporated in the Freedmen Cemetery, they were stone, right? So it wasn't like they just had wooden crosses nailed everywhere. These were real stone carved headstones, right? To show the dignity of these people. Now, my understanding is a lot of those headstones, they disappeared because they were used as landfill for construction at that time. Not only that, they would throw the human remains away, right? This was still the Jim Crow era, so the black community had no power to do anything. As many of you already know, even in the early 1900s, there were lynchings right in downtown Dallas, right? So that shows you the people that lived here could not put up a proper defense, even if their cemeteries and communities were destroyed at the time. So this is the main, incident that really completely destroyed that whole community. In 1961, just what was an open field became just a city park. Just became another city park. They actually had children's swings on it and things of that nature. So very few people, if you weren't from the black or older person from the black community, you would have no idea what that park had been, or that you were playing over people's graves or anything like that. So that's how they did things back then. But in the 1980s, when they were going to widen Central Expressway and deepen it, at first it was just street level. That was Central Expressway. Now they dug it below grade, widened it. So they started hitting human remains. And this time, at least, the political dynamics and power had changed. So once they started hitting human remains this time, archaeologists were brought in from the state. They're still gonna not change their plans for the expressway. They're still gonna do what they plan to do. But at least this time, They brought the bodies up with dignity. The archaeologists studied them. They kind of stored them with dignity and put them in new caskets, and then they were going to reinter them in the area. Now, the good thing was, well, the first time I visited Dallas in 1995, the archaeologists were still on the site. They were still bringing bodies up. This next one shows that they're actually still bringing the bodies up. So they were doing that when I first came here. So I got to talk to the archaeologists. I got to see the artifacts that were coming up. So that really helped me plan my whole design. So this is just an aerial view of the cemetery. The part that is called Freedmen's Memorial, obviously we cannot make a memorial over people's graves, right? So the city of Dallas bought land adjacent to the cemetery for reinterring the bodies that had to be moved because of the construction on Underlimit Avenue and the widening of the expressway to where the memorial itself could be. So this just kind of shows an aerial view of that. So now I'm going to go into the basics I'll go through this pretty quickly. I know I'm taking too much time. The basis of my idea was we have African Americans in the cemetery that were enslaved, and then they transitioned into emancipation. But my principle was that's not the whole story, because we started as free in Africa, then we became enslaved, and then we became emancipated here. So I'm like, I can tell the whole African American genesis that a lot of these people would have went through. So that was the theme and premise I started with. So as we come to the arch, you'll see two figures. They're sculpted in the round. They they represent freedom in Africa, and you can see that they're on the front of the arch. On the back of the arch, we have people that are enslaved. They're in relief, they're not in the round. That's a symbol that they look like they're fully formed people, but they're not three-dimensional people. When you're a slave, you're not considered a fully human person. So so we go from freedom in Africa on the front of the arch, enslavement on the back. With the figures on the front, since this cemetery had been desecrated, I have an African warrior there. His job is to protect that cemetery from ever being desecrated again. I have a female figure, I call her the prophetess. Her job, she's in more of a pose of inviting people into the space, and she's telling the story of the people who are there and deceased. So she's inviting you to hear their story. The cemetery deals with the past and a little bit of the present, but I wanted it to also deal with the future, right? And instead of sculpting a child, I wanted to incorporate in children and actively participating in the memorial. So we had a contest in Dallas Public Schools, and in the elementary schools, there was a poetry contest for children to produce 5-line poems, and in the high school area, they produced 16-line poems. 10 of them were chosen, and they're up on the columns at Freedmen's. This is the ones for the younger children. So they represent the future. Now this, during the time of George Floyd, when he passed away, as a sculptor of public art, you never know if what you've done is successful unless the public tells you is successful, right? So I really know I had kind of done what I originally planned, because I wanted it to be a living monument. I wanted it to be where people came, they had events and things like that. So when they had a vigil for George Floyd and they chose Freedmen's Memorial to have that vigil in his honor, that was an important day for me when I really knew, that this Freedmen's Memorial was a true part of the Dallas community when I saw that happening. And this is just part of that event. Okay, so thank you very much, and I look forward to our conversation.
So as we continue on in our conversation, we'll move expeditiously. I'd like to introduce a man that I got the chance to meet about 10 years ago as I was a young pup, stepping into some community work myself. When I was doing some work with Dallas Independent School District at the foundation, Mr. Roan was one of the first people I was able to connect with. Mr. Louis Roan is the longest living grandson of Dr. Marcellus Clayton Cooper.
I'm supposed to go first?
Yeah, just say a few words about
I thought maybe
Dr.
Cooper. I'm assuming that you can hear me. My name again is Louis Roan Sr. I always say senior because there's a Louis Roan Jr. and I don't want him to fall short because of some of my transgressions. As the brochure said, that I am the oldest living grandson of Dr. M.C. Cooper, Marcellus Clayton Cooper. I need to make sure that I give note to the fact that my cousin Paul C. Anderson, who was named Clayton, Paul Clayton Anderson, is here to support me in my talk this evening. It seems that since I'm the oldest living member and the first male that was born in the family, I'm getting the notoriety, but I'm insisting that he begin to take my place in explaining to those who would listen the history of our grandfather. I've had a very interesting life. It did begin being the grandson of Dr. M.C. Cooper. He was the first African-American dentist in the state of Texas. My grandfather was born in slavery on the Caruth Haven plantation. Now, sometimes in the African-American community, secrets were kept. I had no idea that his residence was 15 minutes from where he was born. My mom, my aunt, his oldest sister, his oldest siblings never shared that information with us. Also had a conversation with a good friend of mine in Chicago, who was an ancestor of one of our greatest generals. And her great-grandmother worked in the pastry portion of the plantation. And you know, the kitchen was separate back then because they figured if a fire started, it wouldn't catch the main house. And we all agreed sitting around the table that those things we have to talk more about, because it's important that both sides of the color line understand and see what happened. Now back to my grandfather, he was free. He went to work, as far as I know, back with his father. Then he came here. And a lot of our history, I don't know how many of you may remember, but Sanger Harris was located on the corner of Elm and Lamar. It's a large department store. It's now a part of the junior college system. Well, he worked as Sanger Harris. I don't know whether it was a janitor, or I've heard some stories that he might have been an elevator operator. But anyway, he saved his money, and he let the staff know that he had a desire to go to Howard University and become a dentist. I don't know the exact number of years that he worked, but he saved his money and he gave his resignation. And I'm told that they gave him a going away party. And my cousin just recently discovered a cane, and they gave him a cane as a going away present, and we have not authenticated that that was the cane. Somehow in history things disappear, but they have a strange way of reappearing. Well, he went to Meharry and he graduated and he came back here. in Dallas and started a very successful dental practice at what was then the Knights of the Pythias, which was an African-American organization. And the building still exists today. His residence still exists at 1521 Villa Street, which is not too far from here, right around Ross and Washington Avenue. His property still stands. I grew up in that property, and so did my cousin Paul. He practiced in the Knights of Pythias building, which has now been converted for years. It was closed. And the city of Dallas negotiated a contract with a contractor to make it into a hotel, but he was not supposed to rearrange any of the artifacts or the decor of that building. I have not been down there to check it out, but I will. My grandfather had a bank. It was called the Penny Savings Bank. I don't know exactly where that bank was, but I'm going to do my research, and I need some historians that know Dallas history to give me the exact location of that bank. The bank, and he funded a dry goods store, probably down on Deep Elm, or what we used to call Deep Elm. I've lived long enough to see downtown Dallas die and be resurrected. I'm assuming that that's where it was. The biggest tragedy came when I think one of his bank officers took the money and absconded with it. So my grandfather, as the story goes, had to sell a lot of his assets in order to make the depositors' money good at the time. And I'm told that he had land out on what is now Lemon and that area out in there. But he sold most of his assets in order to make, FDIC didn't exist then, and he sold most of his assets to cover his depositors. And he died in 1928. I myself, my father was a Pullman porter. My mother worked for the Dallas Independent School District, and she was the building secretary at B.F. Durrell School, which does not, they tore it down. I understand that H-E-B or somebody's going to build a grocery store on that site. I went to college. I graduated from Prairie View A&M. I worked in the aerospace industry. Both my uncles returned from fighting in World War II, and one went on to become a draftsman, and he was the one that encouraged me to become a draftsman. And I worked at Collins Radio for 7 years, actually. Worked on the concept design for the space shuttle. I don't like to tell people that now because I'm not as computer literate as I should be, because I had a chance to take binary math, which is nothing but ones and zeros, and is the foundation for computer work. Now, as I look forward and we talk about entering into the world of AI, artificial intelligence, which is going to be a dominant portion of life as you'll know it, Byron, not me.
Fantastic. That's a perfect segue to Mr. Warren. Thank you so much. Let's hear it for Mr. Warren. Living history and connection, to these worlds that a lot of times we only see in black and white or sometimes safety tone, depending on what era we're looking at it. Thank you for bringing that and making a human connection to that. So Mr. Warren, just for folks who don't know, he's the county clerk of Dallas County. As a county clerk, he's responsible for maintaining and preserving all our public records for the county, including land records, vital records, court records, and with over 2 decades of experience in public service, Mr. Warren has been a champion for transparency and accessibility in the government. He's implemented several initiatives to modernize the county record-keeping system, and he has a beautiful conversation that he wants to share with us. As you can see, that book is big, which means it's got a lot of really good information in it. Mr. Warren, go ahead.
Thank you all, and I appreciate it. Can you hear me? And I appreciate you all having me out here today to talk about these discoveries we made at Dallas County. But unfortunately, this is a small book. I have some that are relatively large. I was elected county clerk for Dallas County in 2006. I took office in 2007. My major was political science. I graduated from Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. But understanding history, I always knew that there was a part of Dallas County's history that included slave records. Of course, I would spend, and as I told Sean Rapp when we did the story, I always knew that there were records in my possession as a county clerk, but I had no point of reference of determining where to locate those books. My statutory responsibility as county clerk is to maintain Dallas County's records proper and in order. It is my responsibility to address the deterioration of Dallas County's records. So with that, one of the first projects I engaged in was the preservation of our historical records. And I had gone through, I think I had preserved maybe about 6,000 books. I've spent like maybe $15 million in the preservation of those records, and I still have more to go. But as the company that I was working with, Cofile Technologies, as they were doing the preservation of the records, they would bring them back to Dallas County. I would store them in a warehouse, and about maybe over the course of 7, 8 years, I would go to the warehouse. I would wear my jeans and tennis shoes, climb up on a ladder about 20 feet in the air, go through shelves, just to do random checks to see if I came across a book that contained information. To no avail, I didn't. Years passed, and I'm going to make this short, so I would rather we engage in a conversation. So years passed, my records information officer retired, and of course, he and I had the conversation. He never found anything. And when he retired, I said, you know what? I think I would want someone with archival experience. And so I hired this young lady once she was onboarded. And so I called her to my office, and so that we can have a conversation. Her name was Allison Oliveira. She's actually the one responsible for finding these records. And so I told her on her second day on the job, I said, Allison, while you were doing an inventory and becoming more familiar with the records that we maintain, I said, I believe I have slave records, but I have no idea where to locate them. 3 months later, she comes to me and she says, Mr. Warren, I think I found the records you were looking for. As it would be, and I'm going to try to do this with one hand, this is actually a probate inventory, a book of probate inventories. The original is much smaller, and so when Allison showed me, she took me to where she saw the books, and it was actually just laying on a shelf in an area where all of our other historical books had been moved. It was falling apart. The binding was in terrible condition. And so we found the book, and so we had the book preserved. If you understand, and I always refer to probate, like I said, this is a probate inventory. I always tell people there's the business side of dying. And so the business side of dying is that when you're deceased, everything that you own goes into an inventory regarding your estate. And this book contains the inventory of several slave owners in Dallas regarding their estate. And it actually has, and I have some of the pages tabbed. I'm going to try to read one. And it actually has the slaves named along with property, other property. So I'm gonna just read one. I have some of the pages tabbed, so in the event you want to look at them, you can. And so this is the estate of Frances Daniel. And as part of her estate, oh, by the way, this is 1854. Dallas County was established in 1846. And so it says, and this is very unique writing, I'm not going to try to read everything, but it refers to Frances Daniel and presents an inventory and appraisement of property of said estate, so far as to it has come to his knowledge as following: separate property of said decedent. One Negro woman, Patience, $900. One Negro boy, Bob, $800. One Negro woman, Rose, $400. One Negro man, Henry, $1,100. And it goes on and it starts to mention, if you know what a mare is, that's a horse, and it mentioned other items. It doesn't separate a human being from cattle and other things and also it has stock hogs, pork hogs, and it just kind of flows as though these individuals were not individuals but property as they were listed as part of an inventory. And so I found that very interesting, and it was extremely fascinating that 1848 and 1854, this is what we were considered. Understand that in a lot of areas after emancipation, a lot of the records that showed property after emancipation were destroyed, so there was no evidence of who was a slave and who was not, so that those individuals could remain in slavery. But if you look at where we've come from and where we are now, I felt duty bound, if you will, to make sure that these books got all the care that they can, and that I'm able to share them with Dallas County as it relates to the history of Dallas County. Duty bound to me refers to hope. Now, just imagine after emancipation, African Americans were set free to a degree, in part. And their hope was to be able to survive, to be able to come together as a family. Because as you know, during slavery, families were broken apart, children were sold, parents were sold. And the struggles that I've heard my mother, my father talk about their parents and their grandparents, that's where duty bound come from, so that history is not forgotten. John Lewis being, and those who crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge for rights, that's where duty bound comes from. If you look at Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, Angela Davis, everyone, Shirley Chisholm, that's where duty bound come from. The hope that we would at some point get to the point where we are, as Martin Luther King says, be true to what you said on paper. Not separate but equal, but all men are created equal, rightly endowed by his creator, and endowed with certain inalienable rights. And so that's where this information becomes very important, not just for us today, but to honor the struggles of our ancestors.
Thank you all, gentlemen. Any questions from the
And then it would be available for the public to come down and actually go through these pages to see the history of Dallas County. I would like to say also, what a lot of people don't know is that when we talk about subdivisions and you talk about property and owning property and people not being allowed in certain neighborhoods, Senator West had a bill in the 87th legislative session regarding restrictive covenants. And what a restrictive covenant means is that in a deed, it says you can only sell to a white person. You couldn't sell to a Latino or Hispanic. You couldn't sell to a black. And so when I'm reviewing the bill and they want to know what impact will it have on us as it relates to us having to remove that information or not recording new deeds that contain that information, I'm kind of torn, because we need to still be reminded of the history, but at the same time we still need to move forward. And so we still have, also have records that shows those restrictive covenants where you can't sell to blacks, it has to be, and so it goes on and on and on. But I do plan to make these books available. Anyone can contact my office and say, okay, John said he was going to do this. When is he going to do it? But it should be in the next 2 to 3 weeks or so, or at least in the next month that I will have these available.
Yes.